I know talking about conspiracy theory is, it's immediate. It's a crisis. It's something that we're all living
Yeah.
with. But at the same time, it was a window into wrestling with the sordid shadow history of white American Christianity, that I am I'm an heir of. Like these are
Mm.
people that in so many ways have influenced people who brought me into the Christian story, and imparted that to me. And none of us are dealing with a pure transmission of the Christian story. My name is Stacy. I was born into a fundamentalist background, particularly independent Baptist, and I was in this very enclosed world, also maybe a reinforcing world between church and home life and school. So it was I was hearing the same thing from many different directions. I grew up, followed that trajectory completely, went to Bible school, got a degree, became a pastor, and then about 2021 found myself out of ministry and pursuing a theology degree. But at the same
Mm.
time, I was in many ways kind of coming through my own deconstructing period. And so I would not recommend
Yeah.
starting a PhD in theology while you're undergoing a theological crisis, existential crisis, all rolled into one. But that's what I did. And we're back in the States now. We've been here for just about a week. So this is very
Nice.
fresh, and looking forward to kind of articulating and sharing a little bit of my story in more detail.
Yeah. So you grew up going to church. Was it pretty much your like typical every Sunday, maybe
Yeah.
a midweek? What did that kind of look like?
Yeah. So it was Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. It
Mhm.
was all very structured. And I do have a lot of fond memories of that. And some of
Yeah.
my even research into the shadow side of my tradition that I came from, it kind of implicates all those memories. There's bittersweetness associated with it. Your childhood is your childhood. And I remember, for example, so the listeners know, my PhD is in conspiracy theories and looking at conspiratorial beliefs in Christian communities in America. And so that's not an academic exercise for me, because growing up, I remember right after 9/11, um, if you were kind of alive during that time, and you remember kind of the conversations that were ongoing, I mean, there was just a wave of bigotry and Islamophobia kind of
Mm.
gripping not just America, but particularly the white church in America. And I remember a missionary actually coming from the UK, which is where I've just spent the last 3 years, in a very diverse community, full of religious pluralism. The missionary came, though I was probably 11, 12, and basically said, the Muslims, quote unquote, right, are
Yeah.
taking over the United Kingdom. And unless we stop them coming here, and bound up in that was this
Mm.
very rigid and very specific understanding of the Christian gospel as some kind of conspiracy busting truth, that Muslims at that time represented the greatest threat, not just to America, but to the church. And those two things were actually one and the same. And so I remember that those conspiracies were very much in the water. And I've said this about Christian nationalism before, Nick, and the same kind of
Mm.
goes with conspiracy theory. What people call Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism, I would have just called Christianity. And the same kind of goes for these conspiratorial narrations, like that framework of hidden evil in 9/11, the hidden evil of terror,
Yeah.
was very much just kind of one way that I would have understood or was given the Christian story, was in this kind of conspiratorial way. Yeah, so my story is that a PhD researcher was not just kind of like some cloistered academic. I wasn't just
Yeah.
like, oh, like let's look at this problem over here. Like it very much was a period of self-implication, confession,
Mm.
discovery. I can't talk and implicate the tradition I came from in many ways without implicating myself,
Yeah.
because I grew up to be a pastor in this
Mm.
tradition, and so it's all bound up together in that.
Yeah. I totally get that because I'm probably not much younger than you. But I remember in around 9/11 as well, going to church, and our church had Bush flags in front of it. President Bush. I was going to a Christian school at the time as well, and a lot of the teachers and the faculty there were wearing their vote for Bush,
Mhm.
and yeah, it wasn't just like, hey, we got to go after the Muslim, but then again, there was also this talk of like, oh, it's the end times and like
Right.
the rapture, and
Right.
we got to go take over Israel, and we got to get the state back, and we got to do all this stuff and try to put these puzzle pieces together on a global scale of
Right.
what's happening overseas and try to fit it to the narrative of Christian and what we believe, and like what the rapture says, like what the Revelation says in the Bible, and trying to put these pieces together. So I definitely can see what you're saying is like, yeah, like it's Christianity, but at the same time, it is so entrenched in these conspiracy theories around just global happenings across
Mhm.
across our globe, right? And so it's always trying to put things in the Christian lens and put that prescription on every single thing that is happening. And we got to do this, because if we don't do it, then it's not going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, then our faith is like out the window.
Right.
But there's no comfortability in the unknown or within any wonder or with any like actual faith. It's always trying to convince ourselves that what we believe is correct. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think I recognize a lot of what you're saying,
Yeah.
because it was kind of the ethos, or maybe just more like just the vibes.
Yeah.
It was in the water, and
Mm,
there was a confidence that was also matched by anxiety. Like there was an anxiety, very obvious. It kind of, the urgency of that anxiety drove every single call to salvation. At the end of the sermon,
mm,
when it was, "Hey, let's
yeah.
have they called it the invitation," right? And they
Yeah.
played the organ, or the piano, or whatever music as you're chatting, and kind of the idea that Christians alone were the ones who were aware that it was about to be the end of the world, and that confidence in the political arena kind of justified all sorts of, when you look back at the Bush administration and what it meant for white American Christians to not just endorse Bush, but also to kind of say like this was God's cause, when
Mm,
as the Iraq War continued,
yeah.
the number of atrocities, black sites, mercenaries that the Bush administration used in the war. I mean, these were all things that was kind of predates us being adults. Some of your
Mm,
listeners may remember differently, but
yeah.
as kids growing up, in the early 2000s, I mean, these were things that we were just watching. Um, I remember going back a little bit farther, and I'll connect this to now. The evangelical support for Trump, which is coming out of the spaces that it sounds like you and I inhabited,
Mm,
was the same spaces that were holding Bill Clinton liable for his own, sexual assaults.
yeah.
And so to see the kind of like that switch, to me, it just amounts to this. There's a scheme inside of white American Christianity that is endlessly justifying itself. We can support Trump because even though he does these things, like at his heart, he's a good man, or he's a baby Christian. I've heard that one before. But
Oh yeah.
when it's Bill Clinton, it's when Bill Clinton commits sexual assault, just like Trump, but it's different. It's, oh well, you don't understand. He's a Soros puppet, and so what's really at stake here is how we're just how this tradition is justifying
Yeah.
itself, and growing up in that, actually gives you a lot of ways to self justify, and using Jesus to do that. I'm just trying to say it's really hard to. It's really easy in these traditions to come out and saying I cannot be wrong. That's
Oh
the
yeah.
hardest thing I think for white American Christians to say, is that we were wrong. We got something wrong. We did wrong, in spite of the fact that we call ourselves sinners. And oh, no one's worse than we are. But like when it actually comes
Mm,
to articulating, naming specifically what our collection of faith has done and perpetrated in America, we are very quick, to point the finger in the other direction. And usually that is not just like, look what they're doing over there, they're bad. It's actually a little bit more insidious. Like, look at all the good, quote unquote, that we're doing over here. I was reading an article doing just this today about the SBC, basically saying, I know we've handled race bad, and I know that we've handled sexual abuse horribly, but at the end of the day, all our statistics say that we're doing good. And the problem with that, and I'm saying this as a former SBC pastor, the problem with that is it has nothing to do with the Christian story and the Christian gospel. It has everything to do with using Jesus as a mascot to justify whatever it is you're trying to do. So yeah, dealing with coming out of independent fundamentalism and then kind of getting into the SBC world and then getting out of it and being in Scotland for 3 years, it really felt like 10. It really felt like 10. I know I threw a lot on you, but yeah,
Yeah.
just sitting with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of difficulty. We don't always get the space to go away and think about what shaped us and how. And there's something about our time in Scotland that was really helpful in that regard.
Yeah. Before we jump to your time in Scotland, because I would definitely want to jump into that, but growing up in this world where you're in church all the time, that's the culture you're living in. What kind of spurred you into like, I'm going to go into ministry? Was it family members in the past maybe gone that route, or was it, I just really like want to continue diving into my faith? What was the draw into going into like a pastoral and studying theology and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, Nick. That is almost, for me, that's been the question for maybe the past 5 years. And I'm still a practicing Christian, but I told my wife recently, I feel like now the way to describe what it's meant to be a practicing Christian is being converted out of Christianity, that so many doors were shut, that in America, ways of speaking, ways of doing, ways of being that people associate with like good Christian behavior or Christian practice. It's just we've been converted out of that. And if for listeners, I mean that's Soren Kierkegaard. That if you want to read someone who thinks and talks about being converted out of religion and being converted out of Christianity, Kierkegaard would be a guy to go to. And to your question, I mean, a lot of it was family. A lot of it was, I'm a firstborn. And so firstborns are notorious people pleasers. And so I can create some space to say that like pursuing being a pastor in so many ways was God's grace, in the sense that a lot of good has come from it. But at the same time, I've had to articulate to myself and be honest enough to admit that a lot of it was me working out the only options that my tradition gave me. Like if you wanted to be a serious Christian, you had to be a pastor. If you wanted to receive the approval of people around you, if you wanted to make them happy, then you should go be a pastor. The problem is those are terrible reasons to become a pastor.
Yeah.
And maybe some of your listeners will understand this if you've been inside these traditions and spaces, is that we're so quick to affirm and authorize young people. I was a pastor at 22. If you look at like human development, my frontal lobe wasn't even developed yet. Now that's not a reason, by itself to say, well, no, you shouldn't go to ministry. But I think there's something about Christianity in America over the last 300 years that has just infused us with this need for speed and our broader uncritical embrace of youth that just completely pulverizes our sense of coming to grips with our own story. At 20, I was not in a position, maybe some of your listeners were, but not really in a position to articulate the difference between the direction of my life and other people's ideas of what my life should be pointed towards and directed towards, and all the ways that we kind of hear the music and substitute God for that. It boils down to a very, very easy way to mistake this idea of calling. If you were in those spaces, and it sounds like you were, we put so much stock on what is your calling? And man,
Yeah.
if anything has changed in my life, the idea of equating your calling with your career, or like the idea that you have to
Mm.
settle into one thing for the rest of your life. It's not wanderlust to say, oh, that's not it. But it is like, I think, terrifying for me to think about faithfulness being staying who I was at 20. Um,
Yeah.
and that's terrifying. And I guess the surprising part of it for me has been it's almost been a ruining that I can only but attribute to a fuller, broader, wider telling of the Christian story, and laying that at God's feet and saying, "Hey, you did this," and so that's what I mean when I say I've been converted out of Christianity, um, because what passed for Christianity, it's not that it was restrictive, but it was that it was play acting, and so a lot of my life was
Mm.
performative. Um,
Wow.
and I made myself responsible for not a version of me, but made myself responsible to fulfill the wishes, dreams, expectations of others that I had absolved, into myself. And now, someone would ask me, "What's your calling?
Yeah.
What's God's will for your life?" I would say, "I'm living it," and not because I have a clue about what's coming next, but because I've come to believe that God's will, God's call, has more to do with the people that you find yourself around and the people that you invite into your life, and less to do with this very American version of a career path that at the end ends up determining and shaping you more than you ever shape it. Um, and so, yeah, I could go on with that question because
Yeah.
it's really the question at the heart of my existence as a human being.
Yeah.
Why did you become a pastor? Where did that come from? And that would require also me telling a broader family story that we don't have time for here.
Yeah.
But it's all bound up in that. And I haven't been alone in kind of navigating and negotiating the bumps and the bruises that come from kind of asking, is there another way to tell this story? What am I missing? Um,
Mm.
and kind of coming out the other end, terrified of who you could have become if uh, if you had equated being faithful, quote unquote, with following the expectations or preconceived notions of other people.
Yeah. That's good. I can definitely see parts of even my own story and what you're sharing. Like I wanted to go into ministry so young. I was
Yeah.
like 18, right? And it's like, oh, I was so entrenched in doing like as a volunteer at church and going to every service I could, volunteering, doing sound, doing graphics, sharing from the stage even from time to time, and becoming a youth leader after I graduated high school. And then I just wanted to go into ministry and like go to whatever Bible college or theology seminary that was cool at the time, right? And jump
Yeah.
into it.
Right.
But I never actually, my life didn't pan out that way to where I was able to go to a Bible college or study theology. But I remember, yeah, wanting to become a pastor so much. It was just like, yeah, like there's so much acceptance here. This is
Mm-hmm.
where I get my worth. People love me. They're pushing me this direction, saying, "Wow, Nick, like you have the gift. It's your calling. Like you're passionate. Like all these positive words. Just yeah, do this, do this. Like fully give everything you can to this cause ministry." Which then, long story short, my listeners already know, like caught me in a bunch of vicious like cycles, like unhealthy cycles,
Yeah.
to where I'd later break down, just because I came out of like I was a sexual abuse survivor,
Mm-hmm.
and so going to church was performative, as you're saying for yourself. It was performative for me of like, no, I have all these pieces put together. I know the answers to life, right? Okay,
Right.
this is my calling. This is where God wants me. But I was hiding something underneath, and that
Mm.
was like this brokenness inside of me. And I was just searching for whatever that would be. So I look kind of how you're doing. I look back on my own life and I'm like, wow, what if I would have just kept going on that
Right.
trajectory of just like performance, performance, performance? What would I have done to keep this brokenness inside me locked up forever? Like, what are the lengths I would have done? How much further could I have been as a Christian? And then I step away for many, many years from church, and um, on my journey back into church, I started this podcast. It was like, oh, yeah. So it's like what you're saying. It's like, it's just, calling really is just like the people you invite into your life. And that's kind of what I'm living day to day as well. It's like looking back of these institutions I've been a part of and saying, wow, like there's some really sad parts, really broken parts, really messy, complicated parts where it's like I don't want to support that. But I don't know, but I don't have the words to communicate that. And so I think this conversation is so can be so fruitful for myself, is because I don't have the PhD, man. I didn't study that. I don't know much about the conspiracies, but I'm just like, but I know for me as like I don't know, a sideline person, right? I'm just like, I know voting for Trump is bad, right? I know, like, I have all these justifications of like, that's wrong. Like, I
Mm.
just can sense it's wrong. But I don't know how to put those pieces together. Maybe it's because I'm tired of putting pieces together.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's where I'm at. And so,
No,
yeah, where are you?
I resonate with that entirely. I love what you said. I'm tired of putting pieces together. And
Yeah.
ironically enough, I think one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century was Friedrich Nietzsche. And
Hmm.
he spoke to the church and some of the best theologians. So Nietzsche was not a practicing Christian, but the
Yeah.
theologians who were read Nietzsche and took him seriously. And what he identified, I think, as a service to Christians and church communities was that morality, Christian morality, as you know, it's just a scheme of justifying yourself before God.
Yeah.
And in so many ways, like you know, like you said, having the credential, it I can't separate it from the story, which is why I love
Yeah.
the space that you're cultivating here, because um, I would feel not seen in my totality if it was just like, oh, it's like Dr. Stacy. Now, like there's a story that went into this,
Yeah.
and for me to, I know talking about conspiracy theory is, I mean, it's immediate, it's a crisis, it's something that we're all living
Yeah.
with, but at the same time, it was a window into talking, wrestling with the sordid shadow history of white American Christianity, that I am I'm an heir of. Like these are
Mm.
people that in so many ways have influenced people who brought me into the Christian story, and imparted that to me. And none of us are dealing with a pure transmission of the Christian story. None of us are absolved from the problems and the injustices that specifically like the church has visited upon
Mm.
the world. And it seems to me that the only way to be Christian is to embrace that legacy and that
Yeah.
troubled inheritance, and to find ways not to deny it, but to repent of it. And I know that sounds very simple, but I think the traditions that we came from actually didn't didn't think about conversion or repentance deep enough, and that conversion is something that is ongoing and that is unsettling. And that's why in so many ways coming back to America has been way harder than leaving ever was.
Mm.
But yeah, I think getting after the ways that our stories have been shaped, and how we as people kind of shut off that responsibility to kind of wrestle with our story, because
Yeah.
failure to do it, I mean, we become then another person. So
Mm.
yeah, I resonate with what you're saying, like getting tired of putting the pieces back together. That kind of give up is something
Mm.
that I think is actually very holy.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about like Moses, and he had this very like curated, crafted, like, oh yeah, I'm the adopted son of Pharaoh, and got a royal birthright and all these things, and then goes off into the wilderness and tries to be his people's liberator and ends up murdering an Egyptian, right? And so he comes back, and the words of his countrymen are still in his ears, you know, like, who made you our leader? And that's what he tells the burning bush, right? That's what he tells God. He said, well,
Yeah.
who am I? And he had internalized all of these stories from and all these reactions. And so that kind of ruining, that kind of refusal, I'm not putting this back together anymore. I'm not, I'm
Yeah.
not playing this game. That's very holy. That's been my experience. And I say holy not as a not as a pious word,
Yeah.
but like as
Right.
something
Yeah.
completely and totally other. Like that. Like
Mm.
holy is like that's not of me. That's outside. That's something else. And like that's unsettling. I always
Yeah.
remember like church ladies being like holy, and like like that sense of like, well, this is someone who's just very virtuous. Now, it's not that holiness doesn't mean that, but it's not the first thing. It's an encounter with something beyond and greater. And I'm getting into it a little bit, but like I think
Yeah.
when I say like I've been converted out of Christianity as a practicing Christian, I think that kind of sums up the kind of
Yeah.
unsettling part of it, for
Mm.
sure.
What were some of those first questions that you started to wrestle with and grapple with into relating to Christianity and your faith and converting yourself out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I probably the first thing I would say is like I didn't choose any of these questions. It's not like they were laid in front of me. I mean, I went
Yeah.
to Bible college and then I went to seminary, right? So I have friends who are not like practicing Christians, and I feel like, and I've told them this, like, yeah, me 5 years ago would have answered that question, or would have pushed this conversation wherever we're talking about in a different direction, and they'll say,
Yeah.
yeah, I know that. you know, which I appreciate, that there
Yeah.
has been a change, and I share that because I knew, quote unquote, all the answers to those thorny questions. Some of the most simple, that I would say, oh no, we don't have to talk about that. You know, evolution, creation,
Mm.
things like that, or 7-day creation, I should say, and evolution. Like those things were in many ways like resolved, and not didn't plant the seed of doubt. And that's really
Mm.
what we're talking about here. Like we're talking
Yeah.
about, to borrow a Star Wars analogy, like there was this designer of like the architecture of my faith, but I feel like in some ways who Jesus has revealed himself to be in my life has been like the one who in so many ways built fatal flaws, into this artificial faith that I've constructed. And he's the one who's kind of revealed this. There's a song, Jason, and I'm gonna man, you're gonna have to come in and edit this. It's his line
I'm
from
leaving
this
it.
song. Man, I'm butchering. Jason Ives, I think is his name, but he has this line, and it says, "I thought God was an architect, but now he's like a pipe bomb." And
Mhm.
I resonate with that idea because I really did have this seemingly artificial, perfectly preserved faith that was almost impenetrable to any kind of doubt, and I'd made it that way. And you can't
Yeah.
sustain that for very long because that's not that's not humanity. That's not like we are fallible, limited creatures. So some of those questions were not like intellectual questions. I would have told you that, oh, like, no, I've got an answer for that. I had an answer for everything.
Yeah.
But actually
Definitely.
what ended up kind of being that pipe bomb in so many ways, was like the moral hypocrisy that was on display within my own tradition. And
Mm.
it goes back to even the performative nature of me being in that tradition too. So it's both hand in hand.
Yeah.
Like, and so like those questions certainly about like sexual abuse and the church's
Mm.
failure to respond to that, the white American Christian retrenchment against any kind of material response to racism in America. Like all of those things, like historically, once you kind of see, you're kind of ruined for any of the kind of arguments of like, oh, well, I mean, I was told civil rights was a long time ago by people who were in school when they were integrated. Right. So like
Yeah.
we have a very, very short awareness of history, even though it's still living with us. So all of those things that kind of, it wasn't rational arguments that were kind of leveraging or the spark, the catalyst for what someone might call deconstruction or a crisis of faith, whatever terminology you want to use to describe it. it was moral questions. It
Mm.
was moral 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 questions, moral hypocrisy that were all kind of just schemes of justifying, you know, and that in and of itself is kind of a performative rebranding. It's not
Yeah.
the real thing. So yeah, I think that really kind of put me in the position where coming to Aberdeen and coming to Scotland was kind of like an escape vector where I needed the space, and not everyone has the opportunity or the availability to just hop on a plane and leave America to go do that. So I recognize
Yeah.
like the privilege of being able to do that, um, and at the same time recognizing that people, not everyone who like steps out of a church does so because quote unquote they want to sin. That people
Mm.
step out of churches because they're actually trying to keep from sin. They're trying to maintain their integrity at all costs, and the failure of the church to recognize that. I say the church, the failure of white American Christianity um,
Mm.
to grapple with the witness of people who leave churches is an indictment on what we are aware of how God works, you know? Um, so yeah, I think that's, to answer your question directly, like it was moral questions, moral
Yeah.
hypocrisy, scandal,
Mm.
things like that.
Yeah. It goes back to like what we were saying earlier. It's like, oh well, Trump can do these sexual abuse things, right? But Clinton can't because one has has adopted the label of like Christian,
Right.
and so it's like, wait, that still doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense. Like we can kill this group of people and justify it, but we can't kill this group of people. Like, and we like to put people in silos and but again, if you adopt a label as Christian, then you're one of us, and so we can't point the gun back at ourselves. Like we can't
Yeah,
do that.
exactly.
And so, as you were saying, like you're going into school and you're like you're learning about all these things. You're like, well, you have to wrestle with the implications as well for
Hmm.
yourself of like, hey, I've been a part of these
Hmm.
systems. I've done this. This is me. This is my history. Like you can't shy away from it because even when I'm interviewing people on this podcast, when I first started, I was having a lot of my friends come on that we grew up together. Just 'cause I was like, I'm starting a podcast. Like, you want to jump on?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I have friends come on, and it's like, hey, we all grew up going to the same church, and your experience is wildly different than mine. And there are topics and subjects that are brought up. I'm like, I didn't experience that at church. That
Yeah.
wasn't
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
perspective. But that doesn't mean to say their experience is wrong,
Mhm.
right? It doesn't invalidate our experiences, but it just challenges what our story and like our beliefs. Like
Yeah.
to believe you is to challenge my own faith, challenge my own story, challenge my own view of the world. It doesn't mean either of you are wrong, but it challenges it. And
Mhm.
so I totally relate to that and resonate with. It's a lot of wrestling with myself. The more I go down this rabbit hole, I have to continue to ask myself these questions. What have I done? What wrongdoing have I done? I needed to take accountability for it. And so I can definitely see how it could be really easy for you to just say, I'm done with not only white American Christian like church, right? But as a whole, to just walk away and say, no, not for me. And so what's tethering you to keep you
Mm.
as you said, someone that still wants to follow Jesus and live the way of Jesus and believe in God, there are so many easy answers or quote like easy answers, easy ways for you to just say no. What is
Yeah.
grounding you to your faith day to day?
That's a good question. I mean, probably the first thing I could say is that I couldn't really read the Bible for probably the first year, like after leaving it. But what I did was I took walks with my supervisor, and who was familiar with my background. And yeah, like that was, in terms of like a personal encounter, was very tethering. There's there's something about the time that we're living in where there are people of all various faiths or convictions, really, who are performing this ministry of "you're not crazy." And I think the space that you're cultivating here with Collision is one of those kind of spaces that hosts conversations and helps people encounter their own story in the story of another. And I
Yeah.
would add to that, right, like how the whole Christian story is wrapped up in those kind of encounters. Um, But I think the tethering, I can only be honest by leading with like, yeah, like I couldn't really open the Bible without being drawn back into that scheme of like where I came from and what I'd seen scripture used to endorse and things like that. It was just really hard to separate. And there was that period, but during that period too, there were friends who were, and I go back to the word I said earlier, were holy, but these
Mm.
were not, this was a different kind of virtue. Um, it was deeply human. And to kind of give an illustration of this, like in an academic setting, to let people know that like sometimes what goes on in these places of higher learning is deeply human and deeply personal. I had submitted a chapter to my supervisor, and this was after that first year. You know, we'd walked, and I just kind of like spilled my guts in so many ways, and he just kind of received all of that. Like that's not his that's not his job as a supervisor, but he
Yeah.
did. That act in and of itself was holy. But I remember sitting in his office, and I handed him some kind of chapter, and he goes, Jared, why are you writing like this? And
Mm.
I had like, Nick, I had, it was so wordy, and not just because I'm long winded. I had used all of these like academic where I just kind of like painted the whole thing so that you couldn't even see my argument. And he goes like, you're burying what you think. And he goes, you need to understand here that like I'm on your side, and that you can come out and say these things. And
Yeah.
I kind of like let out this deep sigh of relief, because there was a moment of encounter and inclusion and embrace, where I basically told him, yeah, that was my fight flight response. Like I'd been trained.
Mm.
That was that performative impulse coming out, and that changed things for me. Not just from an academic sense, but like it was a key kind of high water mark, where a turning point, I guess, where from that point on, there was this newfound confidence that God was this God that I was relearning, this God who was reintroducing himself to me beyond and above all of the false representations of him that I had concocted, but had also been handed to me. And I was free to be myself,
Mm.
to wrestle in that process. So that's changed things for me. In this tethering is less about spiritual discipline, right? That's a very well trod, like common word that people just fill up with all kind of stuff, that they ever want to say. It's a way to be holy. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
read your Bible, pray every day, like just a list of
Mm.
practices. I can't talk that way anymore. It's closed off to me. But what is compelling, and for those who may say, well, I still call it that. I'm, whatever, be free, call it what you want to call it. But it was around that time too, where another friend kind of gave me the language of an inner life, and that, for whatever reason, stuck. And the idea of this inner life being a landscape in my own soul and spirit, where I was able to wrestle out with this God in view of all the other false gods I had constructed. And the idea, let me put it another way, the idea that theology is not totally about getting it right, as it is wrestling with who God really is, and how quickly we can rush to like make sure it's like right, and really all we've done is created a God that will justify us in whatever we want to do. And so, yeah, I hesitate to like list out a list of practices, or,
Yeah.
here's how I remain tethered. But I think it has involved through the encounters with other human beings, where I've been received and accepted and listened to, and have been on the receiving end of conversations like the ones I've just shared, that have in many ways brought me full circle to rethink like what the church is and what it is not, and to have more realistic expectations for the work of theology and what theology does. Like it's not a credentialed expertise, and that we're all in many ways like stumbling forward as theologians, trying to allow God to break our theology. And that to me
Mm.
is resonates more with the way that I've come to recognize this holy God destroying my shelters that I've basically constructed to say, now, like I've got this figured out,
Yeah.
I've got the answers. So yeah, that tethering has more to do with community that tethering has more to do with rethinking what theology actually is, and that tethering has way more to do with this idea of calling as either a vocation or a career, and in its place, kind of recognizing that calling is something that is realized in every season and every moment of your life. It's not something you arrive at; it's something that you live in.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
and yeah, so it's freedom. It's tethered to as disciplined as that may seem. It's freeing, or at least it has been for me, and I can't articulate it any other way at this point.
Yeah. 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 That's good. Do you, given the, I might shift the
Yeah,
conversation a
sure.
little bit, but given the landscape and looking on your story of like just the radical transformation you've encountered and gone through over the years, and you're still experiencing, right? Because you said it's an ongoing process. It's not
Yeah,
just somewhere I arrive at. And then looking at the community in which you're finding yourself in, the community you're cultivating, the communities you're just finding throughout the internet, right? As
yeah,
well,
yeah,
rather than just geographically. Is there any, like, back to Star Wars, right? There's
yeah.
hope, right? But what is that? What is that hope you're finding? What is the hope that you have
Mm.
for the church, the Christian church here in America? Is there hope for its current state and the trajectory in which it's going, or um, is there just like this underground rebel movement that is boiling up? Right?
Yeah. No, I get the Star Wars question now. I get it.
Cool.
Yeah, I think probably the first thing to that I had to confront myself with was that, like, how short-sighted it was of me to lay the failures of a very particular group of people and a tradition, right, that enclosed this particular group of people, white American Christian, even that kind of demands I be a little bit more specific. So, like, there was a common saying that an evangelical is anyone who likes Billy Graham, right? And that was a historian, George Marsden. And so, yeah, I'm talking about evangelicals and institutions and things like that. And that's all pretty recognizable in our current landscape. And how
Yeah.
easy it is maybe to say that, in spite of what some talking heads say, which is, as goes evangelicalism, so goes America, right? So goes the free world. I don't buy any of that. And the church global is a far more diverse set of communities who are being faithful. I'll tell you, one of the things I read that has proven really encouraging is just a paper that kind of explored how Palestinian evangelicals were totally left out of kind of the American evangelical
Mm.
zeitgeist. And this was before uh, the genocide in Gaza. And to the extent that, like, faithful Christians can be found the world over, and that the persecution that many Christians face the world over is not like the persecution in America, and that the persecution in America is soft persecution. It's our opulence and our luxury
Mhm.
is what persecutes us. Our freedom,
Yeah.
what we call freedom, is what persecutes us. And so I think, again, being in touch with global Christians, and there's no such thing as a global Christian, but what I mean by
Mm.
that is to say that there are Christians around the world, and to confuse the American church with the best last great hope is probably the worst thing that we could do. And so I think that in some ways gives me hope, but even that can be manipulated into demographic confidence, right? Like, oh, like, the church
Yeah.
is growing in the global south, which is true. Like, demographically, statistically, it's true. But as a practicing Christian with eyes of faith, like, that's not what the Christian story invites us to place our hope in. And you asked me a question about why I became a pastor, and that's the question at the heart of maybe my story. But
Mm.
then you asked this question, which I think is the only question worth asking all of us, which is, what are we hoping in? Right. And so,
Yeah.
like, I'm not hoping in some great demographic shift. I'm not hoping, even in my brothers and sisters outside of the American church. There's diversity within the American church too. But I think the hope that Scripture tells us to direct our attention to is the reconciled world that God has already accomplished. And that sounds really
Mm.
abstract. I know, like, to listeners who found themselves outside of the
Yeah.
church, like, you'd be completely fair in writing me off and saying, well, this guy never deconstructed, this guy never really, I understand where that kind of puts me on a map.
Yeah.
But all I can say is that if I understand myself to be like a practicing Christian and disciplined by who Jesus has revealed himself to be, the only place that I feel confident, the only place that I'm directed to place my confidence in praying thy kingdom come. And that has nothing to do
Mm.
with demographics. That has nothing to do with
Yeah.
all the techniques that the American church has devised. I've seen how the American church determines churches outside of America with our resources and all that kind of stuff. And I don't want any of that either. But one of my favorite theologians, Karl Barth, says that this prayer of like thy kingdom come, we cannot pray that faithfully, he says, unless we're willing to embody that sacrificially, unless we are prepared to have a different kind of politics as a result of praying that prayer.
Mm.
And that doesn't mean authoritarianism as much as it means, or it doesn't mean governing as much as it means a witness to another way of being, another way of doing. So I'm opening up a
Yeah.
whole can of worms with that question, but I love it because that's the only question that matters. Like, what are we hoping in?
Yeah.
And my hope in life and death is that that Jesus has died and that I will live with him. And that's scandalous. I totally
Mm.
understand that. The
Yeah.
only way that I can articulate my hope in that, though, is to live as if, to live in terms of what the Christian story has already told me, which is that the world has already been reconciled. It just doesn't know it yet. And that insight alone generates practices of peace and practices of nonviolence and practices of inclusion that, um, it's almost like you have to get converted out of Christianity to come to grips
Yeah.
with what it means to say the only thing that the world knows that the church doesn't is the one who sustains it. And that kind of empties us. And I'm stealing that from my supervisor, but that
Mm.
admission alone kind of empties us from any kind of schemes that we would use to say, well, here's what a just war looks like. Um,
Yeah.
here's what we can justify all these heinous acts of violence. And so I guess the scandal of your question is that it does put the tension in the right place. And that's the tension and the crisis point that I think is where the Christian story keeps the tension point is
Mm.
who do you say Jesus is? And I've come full circle to be able to say that.
Yeah.
Because the Jesus that I was introduced to was quite literally just a Jewish John Wayne, a Jewish
Mm.
American John Wayne,
Yeah.
like that. I had John Wayne impersonators come to my church growing up, and they would give
Wow.
a gospel message. So when Dr. Dumais, says Jesus and John Wayne, that yes, the Christians I knew would have identified Jesus as a first century Jew, but in many ways they expected Jesus to show up as a red-blooded, gun-wielding American. And so that's what I
Mm.
mean when I say they would a Jewish Jesus, yes, but more an American Jesus. Um, so yeah, no, but that's the only question worth asking is what is our hope in, and that's the
Mm.
crisis that I'm staking my existence on right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And you said that, like, mentioned how we could easily just write you off, right? Because it's like, oh, did you even
Yeah,
deconstruct? Like, did you even do that?
yeah,
Like, um, the I find for myself in my own spiritual journey of like, yeah, I could say that about you. It's like but that's not where I'm at. I find the more I push into conversations and the more I've met more people along the way and having more conversations around Christianity and God and like the church as a whole, there is this movement where it's like, yeah, it's not about all looking the same. It's not all
mm,
like all these pieces we're putting together. Like we're not all like in one art studio putting together the same puzzle and who can do it the fastest, right? And it's all gonna look the
right.
same. But it's like, no, we're all basically finger painting like our way through spirituality, and it's gonna look different
Mm,
from portrait to portrait, from practice to practice. And so that's what I see here happening in America is like there are more churches that are more diverse and more inclusive. And even in those terms, right, diverse and inclusive, again, those all look different. across
Right.
the board as well.
Right.
And they're not all perfect. There's definitely a lot of flaws and still silos and walls that need to be broken down in inclusive churches, right? Because they're not all racially diverse or sexually diverse. Like there's all these other things that we can break down, but then you bring it to the global scale, like you were mentioning, it's like there are Christians in Gaza right now
Mhm.
being bombed, right? And they're not included.
Mhm.
But here in America, we're looking at Gaza and we're like, no, they're all bad. It all needs to be wiped out. Well, not all of America, right? But there are these like ways we can justify like these wars and like where we're going to go do missions and stuff like that.
Mhm.
It's like to try to fit with to make have them make our puzzle.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but
Exactly.
but as you go overseas, you're like, it's so beautiful. There's so much diversity and so many people that are living like Jesus and embodying the way of Jesus. And it's not John Wayne Jesus. It looks totally different.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, again,
I think,
it doesn't mean they're wrong. It's so
yeah. I will, and to that
yeah,
point, like, this isn't why you brought me on, but like
yeah,
being in churches in Scotland too, like they would be the first ones to say they have their own challenges, their own faults, their own injustices with regards to racism and all of
yeah,
those things. It's just that in our media saturated kind of framework, America tends to be the loudest in the room,
yeah,
and the grass is greener is always kind of the way that we frame it. But the reality is, this statement is true of all the experiences that here, if I'm listening to someone's story, or if they hear what I share here, the
yeah,
simplest thing for me to say to continue on that conversation was, tell me about the God you don't believe in. And,
mm,
and maybe I don't believe in that God either.
yeah,
And there's a whole lot of table setting. There's a whole lot of solidarity that comes with that, while recognizing that across the world, even the way that our economy is constructed, we are all in this more than we think we are. We're all related in more material ways than oftentimes our church discourse lets us admit. But like coming from Scotland out of
yeah,
America, I do think that one of the answers to Christian authoritarianism or extremism or however you want to frame it is a more trenchant ecumenicism, like a more committed way to have dialogue with churches
mm,
outside of your own communion, right? But also outside of your own community, and both have to happen. And
yeah,
insofar as we look across the street and say, well, that church is too conservative for me, or that church is too liberal for me, like at some point that framework isn't going to get you very far. But like you said, having the conversation requires us to admit that maybe our categories are wrong, and you can only have that conversation if people are willing to admit that I'm willing to have my categories changed. And the
yeah,
way that I would describe the way I played the game for so long was keeping a couple cards underneath the table in playing Texas Hold'em. And the
mm,
only way to live life is to live life with all your cards on the table. At least for me, coming from a religious, highly fundamentalist background, God was always involved in that equation. I didn't want to bring both hands in front of God. Well,
wow,
for people who aren't bringing God into that equation, I would still say, like, don't you want to live life with all hands on the table and not to hold
mm,
anything back? And that is a place where conversation can happen,
yeah,
and where we can pursue a common consensus for how to live in this crazy, chaotic world that we've created, but we've also inherited. And that's why I'm excited. I guess that's what keeps me hopeful, is that we still have work to be done. But for me, like, the hope that I have is directed by the Christian story. And I think that given a hearing, the Christian story proves effective, um, but only insofar as Christians repent and
mm,
show ourselves to be the people shaped by that story.
nice, yeah. And to round out the conversation, what would you have wanted to know that you know now, as a young
Oof.
Jared?
I think if I could go back and tell myself at 18, there's a lot of stuff that my 18-year-old self wouldn't believe, whatever I'd say. I think I would want to tell myself, or what I wish I'd known. Hmm. Nick, you're getting at the heart of it, my friend. Probably So yeah, see, this is the problem, and I'll explain it. This is what my mind is thinking
Yeah.
through, because there are a host of things that I could do that my 18-year-old self would only receive as like, well, obviously I've become a heretic. That's what I would.
Yeah.
Oh, I've become liberal. I would use all those catchwords, right? And I would only scare
Mhm.
myself. I think probably the only thing that my 18-year-old self could understand, but yet would still unsettle me, is let God ruin your dream. And I think that would at least be received, but it probably wouldn't be understood until I had lived the next 15 years.
Yeah.
But that's probably something like that,
Mhm.
what I would say. Let God ruin the dream. Let God break you. Um, you know, that kind of thing. Because that I wouldn't be prepared for much else. Of
Yeah.
what I'd say, like, hey, like, yeah, there's a whole lot of things that I can say, but myself would not be ready to receive them.
Mm. Yeah, that's good. And then what's one thing you want people to know about Jared walking away from the conversation?
That we are all going together. If anything I've said has like resonated with you, I probably would say, like, feel free to reach out. You can
Yeah.
find me on Instagram, on the site formerly known as Twitter. And yeah, I think, yeah, I would want people to know that I'm open to conversation. And I think in particular, like, if my story has resonated, then I owe some of my time to helping create that conversation for others, even in disagreement. And yeah, so I think that's what I want people to know. If you see me on the internet streets, come say hey, and I'll be happy to give you a follow back and build a community that way.
Sweet. Thanks, Jared, for coming on and sharing your story.
Thanks, Nick,
It's
for having
been
me.
a
Special
pleasure.
space here.
Thank you.